A 16-year-old boy walks through an abandoned rail yard every morning before sunrise, alone. No phone signal, no witnesses. For 11 days straight, the same faded blue pickup truck has been parked across from the community youth center, engine cold, windows tinted so dark you can't see inside, never once moving until the boy passes. Nobody in this town noticed. Nobody cared. But this morning, the boy says one sentence to the wrong person in a coffee shop. A man covered in road dust and old scars. A biker who hasn't slept in 2 days. A president of a motorcycle club that protects what the law refuses to see. And when that biker looks across the street and recognizes the driver behind that tinted glass, his blood turns to ice. Because the last time he saw that face, 3 people ended up in the ground. If you want to find out what happens when a wounded warrior and a brave kid collide with a ghost from the past, stay with this story until the very end. Drop a like right now and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The rail yard smelled like rust and standing water. That was the first thing you noticed if you ever walked through it before the sun came up, the way the cold air trapped the iron smell close to the ground, mixing it with wet gravel and rotting wood ties that hadn't carried a train in 15 years. The second thing you noticed was the silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you walk faster without knowing why. Noah Mercer noticed both. Every morning, 5 days a week. He was 16, tall for his age but narrow through the shoulders, like his body hadn't decided yet what kind of man it wanted to build. His backpack hung from one strap because the other one had torn 3 months ago, and his mother hadn't replaced it. She wouldn't replace it. That would require her being sober before noon, and Noah had stopped expecting that somewhere around his 14th birthday. He cut through the rail yard because it saved 11 minutes. 11 minutes meant he could sleep 11 minutes longer on a mattress that sat on the floor of a bedroom with no door in a house where the television ran all night because his mother couldn't stand the quiet. 11 minutes was worth the darkness. 11 minutes was worth the smell. The chain-link fence at the east end had been peeled back years ago by someone with bolt cutters and no reason to fix it. Noah squeezed through the gap every morning, his jacket catching on the twisted wire, and crossed the cracked lot behind the old dispatch building. From there, it was a straight shot down Maynard Street to the Community Youth Center, and past the Youth Center another 6 blocks to Ridgemont High School, where Noah maintained a 3.4 GPA. Despite the fact that no one in his household had ever asked him about a single grade. He didn't do it for them. He did it because school was the only place where the lights worked, and nobody screamed. It was a Tuesday in late October when the pattern started. Noah came through the rail yard at 6:14 a.m., same as always, breath visible in the cold air, and turned onto Maynard. The youth center sat on the corner, a converted brick warehouse with painted murals on the side that were already peeling after one summer. And across the street, parked beneath a dead elm tree whose branches scratched the sky like broken fingers, sat a blue pickup truck. Faded paint, rust along the wheel wells, windows tinted dark enough to violate state inspection codes. Engine off. No lights, no movement. Noah noticed it the way you notice anything that doesn't belong. A quick glance, a half-second registration, then gone. He kept walking. The next morning, the truck was there again, same spot, same angle, same dead stillness behind those tinted windows. By the 4th morning, Noah had started watching it with peripheral awareness, the way a stray dog watches a hand it doesn't trust. By the 7th morning, he was certain. The truck arrived before he did, sometime in the darkness between midnight and dawn, and it never moved while he passed. By the 9th morning, he noticed something worse. The truck wasn't watching the street. It was aimed directly at the youth center's front entrance. Noah didn't tell anyone. Not because he didn't care, because there was no one to tell. His mother wouldn't understand the words. The school counselor had a waiting list 40 names long and a look on her face that said she'd already given up on half of them. The one teacher who'd ever seemed interested, Mr. Rowe, sophomore English, had transferred to a district that paid $12,000 more a year, and Noah didn't blame him for leaving. That was the thing about being 16 in a town like Ridgemont. You learned early that the systems designed to help you were just buildings with people inside them who were too tired, too underfunded, or too burned out to do anything more than check boxes and pass you along. You learned to carry things alone. You learned that noticing something wrong was your problem, not theirs. So Noah carried it. 11 days, 11 mornings, one blue truck that never moved. On the 12th morning, he walked into Bowman's coffee house. The coffee shop sat 3 doors down from the youth center, wedged between a closed barbershop and a tax preparation office that only opened from January to April. Bowman's had been there for 22 years. The espresso machine was older than Noah. The floor tiles were cracked in patterns that regulars had memorized. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that became invisible after 5 minutes. It smelled like burned coffee and maple syrup and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke from the years before the ban. Noah didn't go in to buy anything. He went in because the youth center didn't open until 7, and he had 43 minutes to kill, and Bowman's had heat. The woman behind the counter, Linda Bowman, 61, built like a fire hydrant, voice like gravel in a blender, knew every kid who wandered in before school. She didn't charge them for coffee if they looked like they needed it. Noah always looked like he needed it. "Black?" she said without looking up. "Yeah." She poured. He sat, and that was when the door opened again, bringing with it a blast of October air and the smell of engine oil and leather and something else, something sharper, like metal that had been sitting in the cold too long. The man who walked in was not the kind of man who blended into a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. He was mid-40s, 6'1", maybe 6'2", but it was hard to tell because he carried himself with a forward lean, like someone who'd spent years riding into wind. His shoulders were wide inside a black leather jacket that had been worn so long it had molded to his frame like a second skin. Underneath the jacket, a gray thermal shirt. Underneath the shirt, the edges of ink that climbed his neck and disappeared into his jaw. His hands were rough, split knuckles, grease under the nails, a scar across the back of his right hand that looked like it came from a knife or a piece of broken glass. His boots were heavy, black, steel-toed, and when they hit Linda Bowman's tile floor, they made a sound like a slow heartbeat. His face was the color of November, tanned, weathered, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth from years of sun and wind and the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying weight that never gets lighter. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they moved across the room the way a scope moves across a field. Scanning, cataloging, assessing threat. On the back of his jacket, stitched in silver thread over black leather, was a patch. A clenched fist wrapped in iron chain, and above it, 2 words in block capitals, Iron Saints. Below the patch, a single word, President. Gage Callahan hadn't slept in 31 hours. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had become a negotiation since his second tour overseas. A war that officially ended 11 years ago, but still played behind his eyelids every time he closed them. He managed 4 hours on good nights, 3 on bad ones. On nights like last night, when the wind hit the tin roof of the clubhouse at the right angle and made a sound too close to incoming rounds, he managed none. He'd ridden 40 miles from the Iron Saints compound to Ridgemont because a brother named Decker had called at 4 a.m. about a parts shipment for the club's motorcycle repair shop, the legitimate business that kept the Iron Saints funded and the IRS uninterested. Decker ran the shop. Gage ran everything else. The call could have waited until noon, but Gage was already awake, already dressed, already staring at a ceiling that offered nothing, so he rode. Riding was the only therapy he'd ever accepted. The VA had offered him pills, he'd flushed them. They'd offered him group sessions. He'd sat through one, listened to a 24-year-old therapist with clean fingernails explain trauma responses from a textbook, and never went back. They'd offered him a service dog. He'd almost said yes to that one, but the idea of something depending on him for comfort when he could barely keep himself level felt like a cruelty he wasn't willing to commit. So he rode. 50, 60, 80 miles at a time. The engine vibration traveled through the handlebars into his palms, up his forearms, into his chest cavity, and it reset something in his nervous system that nothing else could reach. The noise replaced the noise. The speed replaced the stillness. The cold air forced his lungs to work in a rhythm that his mind eventually followed. By the time he reached Bowman's, his hands were stiff, his face was numb, and he wanted coffee badly enough to walk into a place where someone might try to talk to him. Linda poured without asking. Black, no sugar. She'd served Gage before and had learned the same thing every small-town business owner learns about men like him. Be quick, be quiet, and don't stare at the patches. Gage took the mug and stood at the counter. He didn't sit. Men like Gage rarely sat in places they hadn't secured. His back was to the wall. His eyes were on the door and the window beyond it. That was when the kid spoke. "That blue pickup has been parked here every morning." Noah wasn't talking to Gage. Not directly. He was talking to Linda, or maybe to the room, or maybe to himself in the way that teenagers sometimes externalize thoughts they've been carrying too long. He was looking out the window at Maynard Street, his chin resting on his fist, his coffee untouched. Linda glanced out. "Which one?" "Across from the center, the blue one under the dead tree. It's been there like 12 days. Probably somebody's work truck. It's never running. Nobody ever gets out." Linda shrugged. She had coffee to brew and muffins to warm and a furnace that kept making a sound she couldn't afford to investigate. One more thing she didn't have bandwidth for. But Gage Callahan heard every word. He set his mug down slowly. Not with urgency, with control. The way a man sets something down when his hands need to be free. He turned toward the window, and his pale gray eyes locked onto the blue pickup truck parked 60 yards away beneath the dead elm tree. Faded blue paint. Rust along the wheel wells, tinted windows, and behind those tinted windows, a shape, a silhouette. A man sitting in the driver's seat, still as a held breath. Gage's jaw tightened. A muscle below his left ear pulsed once. His fingers curled slowly against the counter, knuckles whitening, the scar on his right hand stretching. 7 years. 7 years since he'd seen that truck. 7 years since a man named Vincent Cray drove an identical vehicle. Same make, same model, same aftermarket tint. Away from a burning warehouse in Port Ellison, while 3 of Gage's brothers bled on the concrete floor inside. 7 years since Cray vanished with $1.2 million in laundered cash, and a list of names that should have put a dozen powerful men behind bars. Cray had been a fixer, a ghost, a man who worked the space between organized crime and legitimate charity, washing money through foundations that built playgrounds and funded after-school programs while skimming millions into accounts that existed only as numbers on encrypted drives. He'd used the Iron Saints as muscle for one job, just one, before Gage understood what they were really protecting. When Gage pulled his club out and threatened to expose the operation, Cray had responded not with negotiation, but with violence. 3 brothers in the hospital, 1 who never fully recovered, a warehouse burned to ash, and Cray gone like smoke, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks and a reputation that said he'd never surface again. Yet here he was, 60 yards away, watching a youth center in a town so small it barely registered on a state map. Gage didn't move, didn't react visibly, didn't let his breathing change, because men like Gage had learned, in desert heat, in ambush corridors, in the worst moments of their lives, that the first reaction is the one that gets you killed. Think first. Move second. Feel later. He turned back to his coffee, took a slow sip, let the heat fill his mouth and burn the back of his throat. Then he looked at the kid. Noah was still staring out the window with the unfocused gaze of someone who'd been watching too long and thinking too hard. "Hey," Gage said. His voice was low, rough, the texture of a dirt road. "Kid." Noah looked over. His expression didn't change. Kids who grew up in difficult homes learned early not to show surprise. It was a survival instinct that Gage recognized because he'd had it too, 30 years ago, in a different house, with a different kind of silence that pressed down on everything. "You walk past that truck every morning?" "Yeah." "Same time?" "Around 6:15. Anybody ever get out?" "No." "Anybody ever go to the truck? Talk to whoever's inside?" "No, it's just there." Gage nodded. He wanted to ask more, but the boy's eyes had already drifted back to the window, and Gage knew the look. Exhaustion layered over hypervigilance. The kid carried something heavy. Not just the truck, something older, deeper, something in the way he held his body like a question mark, curved inward, protecting whatever was left. Gage pulled a $5 bill from his jacket and slid it across the counter to Linda. "Give him another when he's ready." He picked up his mug, finished the coffee in 2 long swallows, set the mug down with a soft click, and walked toward the door. "Hey," Noah said. Gage stopped, didn't turn. "You know that truck?" Silence. 2 seconds. 3. No, Gage said. He pushed through the door and stepped into the October morning. The cold hit him like a wall. He stood on the sidewalk, pulling on his gloves, and let his eyes pass over the blue pickup one more time without stopping. Casual, controlled. The way you look at a snake you've already identified. Then he walked to his motorcycle, a blacked-out Heritage Custom parked 3 spaces down, swung a leg over, and sat there without starting the engine. His phone was in his hand before his visor was down. The text went to one contact, Decker, need a plate run. Blue Ford F150, Maynard and 4th, Ridgemont, ASAP. Decker's reply came in 8 seconds. On it. Gage sat on the bike and watched the truck in his side mirror. The silhouette behind the glass hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't so much as shifted position. Either the driver didn't know he'd been spotted, or he didn't care. Both possibilities made Gage's stomach tighten. He started the engine. The Harley rumbled to life beneath him like a low growl, vibrating through his boots, his thighs, his spine. He pulled out slowly, keeping his speed even, his head forward, and rode east on Maynard without looking back. 3 blocks later, he circled through a gas station lot, came back west on a parallel street, and parked behind the old dispatch building at the rail yard. From there, he had a clear sight line to the blue pickup. He killed the engine, pulled out a pair of compact binoculars from his saddlebag, standard equipment for long highway rides where road signs started blurring. He focused on the truck, and for the first time in 7 years, Gage Callahan saw the face of Vincent Cray. Older now, thinner, the jawline harder, the eyes deeper in their sockets, but the same man, the same flat, unreadable expression that Gage had last seen illuminated by firelight as a warehouse collapsed behind him. Cray was staring at the youth center, not the building itself, the entrance, specifically the glass door where a woman had just appeared from inside, propping it open with a rubber doorstop and hanging a hand-lettered sign that read, "After School Tutoring, All Ages Welcome." The woman was young, early 30s maybe. She wore a navy pullover and jeans, and her hair was pulled back, and she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had too much to do and too few hours to do it in. She checked her watch, adjusted the sign, scanned the street with a quick automatic glance, the kind people develop when they've learned that the world doesn't always announce its threats. Then she went back inside, and through the binoculars, Gage watched Vincent Cray lean forward in his seat, just slightly, just enough. The way a hunter leans toward prey, Gage lowered the binoculars. His hands were steady. His mind was not. Because the question was no longer whether Vincent Cray had come back. The question was why. And more importantly, the question that made Gage's chest compress and his breath go shallow and the scar on his hand ache like a wound that never fully closed was this. Who had already told Cray where to look? Because Vincent Cray didn't find people. Someone sent him. Gage pulled his phone out again. This time the message went to a different number, a number he hadn't used in 3 years, belonging to a man named Rowan, the Iron Saints intelligence officer, a former Army signals analyst who now lived in a trailer outside of Barton Creek and spent his days monitoring scanner traffic and his nights staring at screens. Cray is alive. Ridgemont, eyes on a youth center. I need everything, tonight. Rowan's reply took 14 seconds. Copy. Full workup by midnight. Gage slid the phone back into his jacket. His hands rested on the handlebars. The engine was off. The October wind moved through the rail yard, carrying the smell of rust and standing water and the faintest trace of diesel from a highway he couldn't see. He thought about calling the local police for exactly 1 second. Then he remembered who Vincent Cray was, a man who'd operated for years inside systems that were supposed to stop him, who had contacts in law enforcement, in legal offices, in places where a phone call from a biker club president would be laughed at, filed, and forgotten. The system wasn't built for this. The system had never been built for this. Gage looked at the blue pickup one more time. Then he looked at the youth center where the woman had gone back inside and the tutoring sign swayed slightly in the wind. And then he looked down the street toward Bowman's Coffee House, where through the front window he could see a 16-year-old boy sitting alone with a cup of coffee, staring at a truck he'd been smart enough to notice and brave enough to mention. A kid nobody was watching out for. A woman nobody had warned. and a ghost that should have stayed dead. Gage started the engine. He didn't ride toward the highway. He didn't ride back to the clubhouse. He rode 2 blocks north, parked in the alley behind Maynard Street, and cut the engine again. He wasn't leaving Ridgemont. Not today. Not until he understood exactly what Vincent Cray wanted with that woman, that building, and that kid who walked through a rail yard alone every morning because no one in his life had ever cared enough to drive him to school. Gage pulled out his phone one more time. He opened the Iron Saints encrypted group channel, the one that connected every patched member within a 200-mile radius. 23 men. Combat veterans, mechanics, former convicts, fathers who'd lost custody, husbands who'd buried wives, brothers who had nothing left except the patches on their backs and the code that held them together. He typed 5 words. Church tonight. Full table. Mandatory. In the Iron Saints, church meant one thing, a crisis that required every brother present, every phone off, every door locked. The last time Gage had called a full church was 2 years ago, when a member's teenage daughter had gone missing for 72 hours. They'd found her. They'd brought her home. They'd made sure the man responsible never repeated the act. No police report was ever filed, no newspaper ever covered it. Some things don't make the news. Some things are handled by men the world pretends don't exist. By 7 a.m., the blue pickup pulled away from Maynard Street. Slowly. No signal. No urgency. It turned left at the intersection and disappeared south toward the county line. Noah Mercer walked out of Bowman's Coffee House at 6:58, backpack on one shoulder, head down, moving toward school the way he always moved, fast, quiet, and invisible. He didn't see the biker parked in the alley 2 blocks north, watching him through a cracked mirror until the boy disappeared around the corner. He didn't know that the sentence he'd spoken 20 minutes ago over a cup of free coffee had just triggered a chain of events that would reshape every life on Maynard Street. And he didn't know, couldn't possibly know, that by this time tomorrow, the woman inside that youth center would receive a phone call that would make her hands shake so badly she'd drop the receiver. Because someone had finally come looking for what her dead husband had hidden. And the only thing standing between her and the man in the blue pickup was a motorcycle club she'd never heard of, led by a broken soldier who hadn't saved anyone in years, and who was no longer sure he still could. The Iron Saints clubhouse sat 14 miles outside Ridgemont, on a 2-lane road that didn't appear on most GPS systems. It had been a feed mill once. Concrete block walls, corrugated steel roof, loading dock on the south side where grain trucks used to back in. The Saints had bought it at auction 9 years ago for $11,000 and spent the next 3 years turning it into something that wasn't quite a home and wasn't quite a fortress, but functioned as both. The main hall was 60 feet long, with a wooden table down the center that could seat 24. The chairs didn't match. The floor was poured concrete with a drainage channel that still ran along the east wall. The lights were industrial pendants on chains, and they cast the kind of yellow glow that made every face look 10 years older and every shadow twice as deep. By 9 p.m., every chair was filled. 23 men. Some had ridden from as far as Barton Creek, 90 miles north. Some had come from Colton, 60 miles east, through hill country roads, where deer stood in the headlights like frozen sentinels. 2 had driven trucks because their bikes were in the shop, a fact that earned them exactly the kind of quiet looks that didn't need words. You showed up to church on 2 wheels, or you explained why, and nobody asked twice. The room smelled like leather and exhaust fumes, and the particular combination of sweat and cold air that happens when men ride hard through October darkness and walk inside without taking off their jackets. Coffee sat in steel thermoses along the table. No alcohol, not during church. That was one of the rules Gage had set when he took the gavel 4 years ago, and nobody had challenged it since because they all understood why. Half the men at this table had fought their way back from the bottom of a bottle. The other half were still fighting. Gage stood at the head of the table. He hadn't sat down, hadn't taken off his riding gloves. His helmet rested on the table in front of him like a skull, visor up, reflecting the yellow light. His face was expressionless, not calm, but controlled, the way a dam is controlled, holding back pressure that would destroy everything downstream if the structure cracked. He let the silence work. 30 seconds, a minute. Men shifted in their chairs, leather creaked. Someone coughed. A lighter clicked open and shut, open and shut, open and shut, a nervous habit from a brother named Pike, who'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand in Fallujah and had never stopped fidgeting with the remaining 3. "Vincent Cray," Gage said. The name hit the room like a stone dropping into still water. Ripples moved across faces. Some froze. Some looked down. 2 men, Decker and a road captain named Harlan, exchanged a glance so fast it barely existed. "He's in Ridgemont," Gage continued. "Been there at least 12 days, sitting in a blue pickup across from the Community Youth Center on Maynard Street, watching, every morning, same time, same position." He paused. Let it land. "A 16-year-old kid spotted him. Kid walks through the rail yard before school every day. Nobody else noticed. Nobody else cared." Pike's lighter stopped clicking. "Rowan?" Gage said, turning to the far end of the table. Rowan was the smallest man in the room. 5'7", 150, wire-rimmed glasses that he pushed up his nose every 40 seconds like clockwork. He'd been Army Signals Intelligence for 8 years before a traumatic brain injury from a training accident sent him home with a medical discharge and a disability check that barely covered rent. He looked like a librarian someone had accidentally dressed in motorcycle leather. He was the most dangerous person at the table, and everyone knew it because information was more lethal than any weapon in the room. Rowan opened a manila folder. His hands were steady. They were always steady. "Plate comes back to a rental company in Port Ellison, corporate lease. The company that leased it is a shell, registered 6 months ago. No employees, no revenue, single signatory. I traced the signatory through 3 layers. He paused, adjusted his glasses. "It dead ends at a trust fund managed by a law firm called Harden and Locke, same firm that handled financial compliance for the Whitfield Foundation." The ripples became waves. The Whitfield Foundation. Every man at this table knew that name. 7 years ago, the Iron Saints had been hired, through Cray, through intermediaries, through a chain of handshakes and cash payments that seemed clean at the time, to provide security for a series of charity fundraisers organized by the Whitfield Foundation. It was supposed to be simple. Stand at doors, look intimidating, go home, get paid. It wasn't simple. The fundraisers were money laundering fronts. The foundation collected millions in donations for children's programs that existed only on paper, cycled the cash through offshore accounts, and used the Iron Saints' visible presence at events to legitimize operations that were rotten to the core. By the time Gage figured it out, by the time he pulled his club out and threatened to go public, Cray had already set the fire. 3 brothers hospitalized. 1, a man named Sutton, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and survived 3 IED detonations, left with nerve damage in both legs that put him in a wheelchair for 11 months. The warehouse where they'd stored club equipment burned to the ground, and Cray vanished. That was the official version, the version every brother at this table believed. Gage knew there was another version, a version he'd never spoken aloud, a version that involved a phone call he'd made the night before the fire, a call to a contact inside the Whitfield Foundation, trying to negotiate a quiet exit for the club. A call that, in retrospect, might have been the very thing that tipped Cray off and triggered the attack. Gage had carried that weight for 7 years. It sat in his chest like a stone that had grown roots. So what's he doing watching a youth center? The question came from Harlan, the road captain. He was 52, built like a concrete pillar, with a beard that reached his sternum and eyes that never blinked at the right speed. He'd been with the Saints longer than anyone except Gage. He was loyal, the way a guard dog is loyal, completely, violently, and with no tolerance for uncertainty. "That's what I'm trying to determine," Gage said. "Trying." Harlan repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "You called full church to tell us you're trying." The room went still. Gage looked at Harlan. Didn't blink, didn't breathe visibly, just looked, with those pale gray eyes that could hold a man's gaze the way a vice holds metal. "I called full church because the last time Cray showed up, 3 of us ended up on hospital floors. That enough reason for you, brother?" Harlan's jaw moved sideways, a slow grind, like tectonic plates shifting. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The challenge wasn't really about the reason for church. It was about something older, something that had been building for months, long before Cray's name re-entered the picture. Harlan believed Gage had become cautious. Too cautious. The kind of cautious that, in Harlan's view, turned a wolf into a watchdog. The club had once been aggressive, not violent for violence's sake, but willing to move first, hit hard, and deal with consequences afterward. Under Gage's presidency, they'd pulled back, focused on the repair shop, funded community programs, helped veterans find housing, done the kind of work that didn't make headlines and didn't make enemies. Harlan respected it, but he didn't trust it, because in his experience, the world didn't reward restraint. The world rewarded the man willing to act while everyone else was still thinking. "I'm not asking for a vote," Gage said, addressing the table. "Not yet. I'm telling you what I know and what I need. Rowan's running a full background on the youth center. Staff, volunteers, funding, history. Decker's pulling records on the Whitfield Foundation's last known assets. I need eyes on Maynard Street starting tomorrow morning, rotating shifts, 2 brothers at a time, civilian vehicles only. No cuts, no patches. Nothing that connects to this club. We watch. We gather. We understand. Then we move. And if Cray moves first," Harlan said, "then we adjust." Adjust. Harlan said the word the same way he'd said trying, like it left a taste in his mouth he wanted to spit out. "The man burned us, Gage. Put Sutton in a chair for a year. And you want to sit in parking lots with binoculars like we're on some kind of stakeout?" A murmur moved through the room, not loud, not organized, but present. The sound of men who hadn't spoken yet forming opinions they weren't ready to voice. Gage felt it, the fracture line. Thin as a hair, but real. "Sutton," Gage said quietly. "You want to talk about Sutton?" "Damn right I do." "Then let's talk about Sutton. Let's talk about how I'm the one who signed us onto that Whitfield job. How I'm the one who shook Cray's hand and took his money and put my brothers in a building that I didn't vet, doing work I didn't fully understand, because the payout was good and the question seemed unnecessary." Gage's voice didn't rise. It lowered. Dropped into a register that forced every man in the room to lean forward to hear. "You think I don't carry that? You think I don't see Sutton's face every time I close my eyes? I'm the reason that man spent 11 months learning to walk again. I know that. I've always known that. And if you think my caution now is weakness, Harlan, I invite you to consider the possibility that it's the only thing keeping another brother out of a wheelchair." Silence. Absolute. The pendulum light swung faintly in a draft from the loading dock, casting shadows that moved across the table like slow-motion ghosts. Harlan looked at Gage for a long time. Then he looked at the table. His thick fingers wrapped around his coffee thermos, and he lifted it to his mouth and drank without tasting. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't surrender. It was the momentary retreat of a man who knew his point had landed, but who also knew, deep in the part of him that still respected the gavel, that Gage wasn't wrong. Not entirely. "Rowan," Gage said again. "The youth center. What do you have?" Rowan flipped a page. "Center's been operating for 4 years, funded by a combination of city grants and private donations. Director is a woman named Claire Bennett, 32. Widowed. Husband died 3 years ago, car accident on Route 9, single vehicle, late at night. She was left with the house, the center, and custody of her younger brother. Kid's name is Marcus. 14. She connected to the foundation? Not directly, but her husband was." Rowan pushed his glasses up. "Ethan Bennett. He was an accountant. Freelance. Worked for a dozen nonprofits in the region, including, for approximately 18 months, the Whitfield Foundation." The room temperature seemed to drop. "He left the foundation 8 months before it collapsed," Rowan continued. "Quit. No formal reason given, but I pulled his employment timeline against the foundation's financial disclosures. And there's a gap, a period of about 6 weeks where the foundation's books show payments to a consulting firm that doesn't exist. Same pattern as the shell companies Cray used." "You think Bennett found the fraud?" Decker said. It wasn't a question. "I think Bennett copied the evidence," Rowan said. "And I think that's why Cray is sitting outside his widow's workplace every morning with the engine off." Gage's hands were flat on the table now, fingers spread. He could feel the grain of the wood through his riding gloves, rough, splintered, real. He needed that texture, needed something solid to anchor to, because the implications of what Rowan had just said were spiraling outward at a speed that made his head feel loose on his neck. If Ethan Bennett had copied financial records proving the Whitfield Foundation's money laundering, records that could expose not just Cray, but every person above him in the chain, then those records were worth killing for. They had been worth killing for 3 years ago, when Ethan Bennett's car had gone off Route 9 on a clear night with no mechanical failure and no other vehicles involved. An accident that wasn't an accident. And now the man who'd ordered it, or the man who worked for the man who'd ordered it, was sitting outside the dead man's widow's building, waiting. Waiting for what? She doesn't know, Gage said. Not a question. Almost certainly not, Rowan confirmed. If she knew what her husband had, she would have used it by now, or someone would have taken it. The fact that Cray's still watching, still sitting, means he hasn't located it yet. He's surveilling, looking for patterns, trying to figure out where Bennett hid it before he died. Or trying to figure out if she's the kind of person he can pressure into giving it up, Decker added. Or both, Rowan said. Gage straightened up, his spine cracked audibly. 31 hours without sleep had become 37, and the fatigue was no longer a weight. It was a texture, a grit behind his eyes, a buzzing in his temples that made the yellow light seem to pulse. The kid, he said. Noah, the one who spotted the truck. What about him? Harlan asked. He walks past that truck every morning, through the rail yard, alone. No parents waiting, no ride, no phone signal until he hits Maynard Street. Gage paused. If Cray is as careful as he used to be, he's already cataloged everyone who passes that truck on a regular basis, which means he knows the kid's face, he knows the kid's route, and he knows the kid talks to people. The implication settled over the room like frost. So we've got a woman who doesn't know she's sitting on evidence that could bring down a criminal network, Decker said slowly. A kid who's unknowingly walking past a predator every morning. And a ghost from our past who has a documented history of making problems disappear permanently. That's the situation, Gage said. And you want to watch. Harlan again. But this time his voice was different, quieter. The combativeness had bled out, and something else had replaced it. Something that sounded almost like fear, though Harlan would have broken a man's jaw for calling it that. I want to understand the board before we flip the table, Gage said. If we move on Cray now, without knowing who sent him, without knowing who he's reporting to, without understanding the full scope of what's at play, we don't end this. We just push it underground. And it comes back. It always comes back. He looked around the table, face by face, brother by brother. Some met his eyes. Some didn't. Pike's lighter had started clicking again. Open, shut, open, shut. A metronome for the room's collective anxiety. Rowan, I need the complete financial trail on the Whitfield Foundation. Every account, every shell company, every name. 48 hours. Decker, get a team on Maynard Street by 5 a.m. 2 brothers, plain clothes. I want timestamps on that pickup. Every arrival, every departure, every person who enters or exits the youth center. Done. Harlan. Gage looked at his road captain. I need you to reach out to the Saints chapter in Port Ellison. Quietly. Find out if anyone there has heard noise about Cray resurfaces. Old contacts, new contracts, anything. Harlan nodded once. A single, sharp movement. Whatever disagreement remained between them, it would wait. In the Saints, the gavel spoke, and the table listened. That was the code. You could argue before the decision. You could argue after the operation. But during you followed the president or you turned in your patch. Nobody was turning in patches tonight. One more thing, Gage said. He pulled his phone from his jacket and set it on the table, screen down. Nobody contacts local law enforcement. Nobody. Cray survived for 7 years because he has people inside systems we don't control. One wrong phone call, one report filed to the wrong desk, and he vanishes again. And this time he takes whatever he's after with him, or he buries anyone who might be able to find it. Including the woman, Rowan said. Including the woman. The meeting ended at 10:15. Brothers filed out into the cold, boot heels on concrete, engines firing one by one in the gravel lot outside, headlights sweeping across the tree line like searchlights. The sound built, 5 engines, 10, 15, until the night vibrated with it, a low mechanical thunder that rolled across the empty fields and faded toward distant highways. Gage stood at the loading dock door and watched them go. Decker stood beside him, smoking. The cherry of his cigarette was the only warm color in the darkness. "You should sleep," Decker said. "Probably. You won't." "No." Decker took a long drag, exhaled slowly. The smoke dissolved into the October air like it had never existed. "Harlan's not wrong," Decker said quietly. Gage didn't turn. "I know. The club's been patient. They followed your lead, but patience has a shelf life, Gage. These are men who are trained to act, not to wait. I'm not asking them to wait. I'm asking them to aim before they fire." "Same thing. To men like Harlan, it's the same thing." Gage pulled his gloves tighter. The leather was cold and stiff. "If we go at Cray blind, people die. Maybe us. Maybe that woman. Maybe that kid. And if we wait too long, people die anyway. That's the equation, brother. There's no clean answer." They stood in silence. The last taillight disappeared down the road. An owl called from somewhere in the tree line, a low, mournful sound that hung in the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. "There's something I never told the table," Gage said. Decker didn't move, didn't look over, just waited. The way a man waits when he knows what's coming is heavy enough to change the air pressure in the room. "The night before the warehouse fire, 7 years ago, I called the Whitfield Foundation directly, used a personal line, tried to negotiate a walkaway for the club, clean break. No exposure, no retaliation, no paperwork." Decker's cigarette stopped moving. "Cray hit us 18 hours later." The silence that followed was different from the silence inside the clubhouse. That silence had been controlled, men restraining their reactions, holding their discipline. This silence was the absence of sound that happens when a truth rearranges everything around it. "You think your call triggered the hit," Decker said. "I've thought it every day for 7 years. Does Harlan know?" "No." "If he finds out, I know. He'll call for a vote, challenge the gavel." "I know." Decker dropped his cigarette, ground it under his boot heel. The ember died with a faint hiss against the cold gravel. "Why are you telling me this now?" Gage finally turned. In the darkness, his face was all angles and shadows, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been that morning, the pallor of exhaustion giving his skin a grayish cast that made him look less like a man and more like something carved from the same concrete as the building behind them. "Because if Cray is here for what I think he's here for, this is going to get loud. And when it does, Harlan's going to start asking questions I've been avoiding for 7 years. And I need one person at that table who already knows the answer." Decker stared at him. 5 seconds. 10. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out another cigarette, lit it, took a drag. "You're a stubborn, reckless, guilt-ridden son of a bitch," Decker said. "And you're still the best president this club has ever had. So yeah, I know. And it doesn't change a damn thing." He turned and walked toward his bike. Gage stood alone on the loading dock. The wind had picked up, and it carried the smell of frost and dead leaves and the faint, distant hum of a highway where trucks moved through the night like slow-moving animals migrating toward morning. He pulled out his phone. One new message. From Rowan. Started the financial trace. Found something already. Ethan Bennett's last personal purchase before he died. A handcrafted wooden memory box from a custom furniture maker in Grayfield. Paid cash. No shipping address. Picked it up in person 2 weeks before the accident. Gage read the message twice. 3 times. A memory box. Handcrafted. Paid cash. No trail. The kind of object a man buys when he wants to hide something in plain sight. Something small enough to hold a drive or a set of documents. Ordinary enough to sit on a shelf for years without drawing attention. Personal enough that his wife would keep it forever. Gage typed back, "Where's the box now?" Rowan's reply came in 9 seconds. "Best guess, still in Claire Bennett's house. She never moved after his death. Same address, same furniture. She kept everything." Gage stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed. Then he looked up at the sky, overcast, starless, the kind of sky that pressed down on the earth like a lid. Claire Bennett had no idea what was in her house. Vincent Cray had been sitting outside her building for 12 days trying to find it. And somewhere between the clubhouse and Maynard Street, A 16-year-old boy was sleeping in a house with no bedroom door, on a mattress on the floor, with no idea that the photograph he'd taken of a license plate 2 days ago, a casual shot for a school project, snapped through a chain-link fence with a phone camera, was already being cataloged by a man who had made 3 people disappear and had shown no hesitation about making it 4. Because what Gage didn't know yet, what he wouldn't learn until 6:14 tomorrow morning, when Noah Mercer walked through the rail yard and reached for his phone to check the time, was that the blue pickup would not be parked in its usual spot. It would be parked somewhere new, directly across from Noah's house, engine running, lights off. And in the passenger seat, where there had never been anyone before, a second silhouette would be visible through the tinted glass, leaning forward, holding something that reflected the faint glow of a streetlight. Something that looked from 60 yards away exactly like a photograph of Noah. Noah saw the truck at 6:09 a.m., not on Maynard Street, not across from the youth center, not in its usual spot beneath the dead elm tree where it had sat for 12 mornings like a held breath waiting to exhale. It was parked across from his house. His house. The narrow 2-story rental on Caldwell Avenue with the sagging porch and the mailbox that hadn't closed properly since last winter, and the front window where the blinds were always crooked because his mother never straightened them and Noah had stopped caring. The truck sat beneath a streetlight that flickered every 8 seconds, a rhythm Noah knew because he'd counted it on nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the television downstairs played infomercials to an audience of empty beer cans. The engine was running. A thin trail of exhaust curled upward in the cold air and disappeared. And in the passenger seat, where there had never been anyone before, a shape, a second person, leaning forward, holding something flat and rectangular that caught the streetlight's dying pulse every 8 seconds. Noah stood at his bedroom window. His breath fogged the glass. His phone was in his hand. The screen showed 6:09. He was supposed to leave in 5 minutes, walk down the porch steps, turn left, cut through the Hendersons' backyard, hit the rail yard. Same route, same timing, same invisible path through a town that had never once looked up long enough to notice him. But the truck was here now. The truck had moved. The truck had followed him home. His thumb hovered over the phone screen. Call who? His mother was unconscious on the couch downstairs. She'd been drinking since 4 p.m. yesterday and wouldn't surface until noon. The school had a safety hotline that connected to a voicemail, that connected to a counselor who checked messages on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The police non-emergency line would ask him to describe the vehicle, give a report number, and tell him someone would follow up within 72 hours. 72 hours. Noah had been invisible his entire life. But right now, standing at a window with fogged glass and a dead phone signal and a truck idling outside his house, he understood something that most 16-year-olds never have to learn. Being invisible is a kind of safety. When nobody sees you, nobody targets you. The moment someone starts looking, really looking, the invisibility that protected you becomes the very thing that makes you vulnerable, because no one will notice when you disappear. He stepped back from the window. His heel caught the edge of his mattress and he sat down hard, the frame rattling against the baseboard. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from something deeper, a vibration in his chest that felt like an engine revving inside a space too small to contain it. He did the only thing he could think of. He opened his phone's camera and took a photograph of the truck through the window. Then another. Then a third, zooming in on the passenger side silhouette, trying to capture whatever the figure was holding. The images were grainy, dark, blurred by condensation on the glass. But in the third photograph, the streetlight pulsed at the right moment, and for one frozen instant, the object in the passenger's hands was illuminated with terrible clarity. It was a photograph. A printed photograph. 8 by 10, maybe larger. A photograph of Noah, standing outside Bowman's coffee house, backpack on one shoulder, head turned slightly, mid-step, caught in the act of walking toward school on a morning that looked like every other morning, except that someone had been watching him closely enough to frame the shot. Noah's phone slipped from his fingers and hit the mattress without a sound. He didn't leave for school that morning. At 6:47 a.m., the blue pickup pulled away from Caldwell Avenue. No signal, no urgency. It rolled through the intersection and turned south, the same direction it always disappeared. And within 90 seconds, the street was empty and quiet, and the flickering streetlight illuminated nothing but cracked asphalt and the mailbox that wouldn't close. At 7:02 a.m., Gage Callahan's phone rang. He was in the clubhouse garage standing over a disassembled transmission on a steel workbench, hands coated in gear oil. He'd slept 2 hours, collapsed on the cot in the back office around midnight, and woke at 4 with the taste of metal in his mouth and a dream he couldn't remember. But that left his pulse hammering for 10 minutes after his eyes opened. The coffee in his hand was his fourth cup. It had stopped working after the second. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. Local area code. He answered, "Yeah." Breathing, fast, too fast for an adult. The shallow, rapid cadence of a teenager trying to control panic and failing. "It's the kid from the coffee shop." Gage set the coffee down. "Noah. How do you know my name?" "Linda told me." "What's going on?" A pause. 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Gage heard everything: the tremor in the breath, the tightness in the throat, the sound of a boy trying to decide whether the stranger on the other end of the line was more dangerous than the one parked outside his house. "The truck! The blue one! It was outside my house this morning." Gage's hand closed around the edge of the workbench. His knuckles whitened. The gear oil made his grip slide, and he squeezed harder, hard enough to feel the steel edge bite into the meat of his palm. "Talk to me. Everything. What time? What you saw, every detail." Noah talked. Noah, his voice was flat, controlled in the way that kids from hard homes learn to control their voices. Push the emotion down. Give the facts. Don't let anyone hear the crack. He described the truck, the running engine, the second person, the photograph. "A photograph," Gage repeated. "Of you." "Yeah." "You're sure?" "I took a picture of it through my window. It's me, standing outside Bowman's." Silence. 2 seconds. 5. The garage was cold and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that burrowed into the back of Gage's skull like a drill bit. "Where are you right now?" "My room." "Is anyone else in the house?" "My mom. She's asleep." The way he said asleep told Gage everything he needed to know about what kind of sleep it was. "Stay in the house. Don't go to school. Don't go outside." "I'm sending someone." "Who?" "A brother." "A what?" "Someone I trust. His name is Decker. He drives a black truck. He'll park on your street and stay there until I get there. Don't open the door for anyone else." "I don't even know you." "I know, but you called me." Another pause. The pause of a boy weighing the evidence. A stranger in a leather jacket who'd bought him coffee and lied about recognizing a truck, versus the certainty of a photograph of his own face held in the hands of someone sitting outside his home in the dark. "Okay," Noah said. "Okay." Gage hung up. He stood motionless for 4 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed Decker. "Caldwell Avenue. The kid. Now." "How bad?" "They have his picture." Decker didn't ask another question. The line went dead, and 40 seconds later, Gage heard the black truck's engine fire in the lot outside, tires spitting gravel, and the sound fading east toward town. Gage wiped his hands on a shop rag that was already black with grease. The rag left streaks on his palms that looked like bruises. He stared at them for a moment, the lines of oil tracing the creases in his skin, following the scar on his right hand, pooling in the valleys between his knuckles. Then he called Rowan. "The surveillance shifted. They're watching the kid now." "That means he's been flagged." "I know what it means, Rowan. Gage, if they photographed him, they've already run his background. They know where he lives. They know his school. They know his mother's name, her record, her habits. They know he's unprotected." I said I know. "What I'm telling you is that the timeline just compressed. Cray isn't surveilling anymore. He's cataloging assets and liabilities. The kid is a liability. He spotted the truck. He talked to someone. Cray doesn't leave liabilities in place." Gage's jaw clenched so hard his molars creaked. "How much time do we have?" "If Cray follows his old pattern, he neutralizes loose ends before the primary operation. That means the kid goes first, then Claire." "How much time, Rowan?" 24 hours, maybe 48, but I wouldn't bet on 48. Gage ended the call. He stood in the garage with the fluorescent light buzzing above him, and the smell of gear oil and cold concrete filling his lungs, and the transmission lying open on the workbench like a mechanical heart dissected for inspection. 24 hours. A kid he'd known for less than 2 days. A woman he'd never spoken to. And a man he'd failed to stop 7 years ago because he'd made a phone call that he thought was diplomacy, but was actually a detonation. He left the garage and walked through the clubhouse to the back office. The office was small, a metal desk, a filing cabinet, a wall-mounted board covered in photographs and notes and maps held in place with pushpins and tape that was curling at the edges. Gage had added to this board over the years the way an insomniac adds to a journal. Compulsively, incompletely, always at hours when the rest of the world was asleep. He pinned Noah's name to the board. Below it, Claire Bennett's. Below that, Ethan Bennett's. Below that, Vincent Cray's. Then he drew a line between Cray and the Whitfield Foundation. Then another line between the foundation and Ethan Bennett. Then a line between Ethan and Claire. Then a line between Claire and the Youth Center. Then a line between the Youth Center and Noah. And then he drew the line he'd been avoiding. From himself to the Whitfield Foundation. From his phone call 7 years ago to the fire that followed. From the fire to Sutton's wheelchair. From Sutton's wheelchair to the guilt that had hollowed him out from the inside like water eroding limestone, leaving a man-shaped shell that walked and talked and rode and led, but hadn't felt whole since the night the warehouse burned. Every line led back to him. Every single one. At 9:30 a.m., Gage arrived on Caldwell Avenue. Decker's black truck was parked 4 houses down from Noah's, angled so the mirrors covered the street in both directions. Decker was behind the wheel, window cracked, cigarette smoke drifting out in a thin ribbon. He gave Gage a single nod as the Harley rolled past. Gage parked in front of Noah's house and killed the engine. He sat on the bike for a moment, looking at the house. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted. The screen door was torn and hung at an angle. Through the front window, he could see the blue flicker of a television in a dark room. He knocked. No answer. Knocked again. After 30 seconds, the door opened 4 inches, held by a chain, and a face appeared in the gap. A woman's face, swollen with sleep and something else, eyes narrowed against the daylight like it was a personal attack. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Gage. I'm here about your son." "Noah. What did he do?" The question told Gage everything, not what happened to Noah. What did Noah do? The default assumption that the child was the problem. "He didn't do anything. I need to talk to him. He's in his room. I don't let strangers in my house." "Then send him out." The woman stared at him. Her eyes traveled from his face to his jacket, lingering on the patches. She didn't recognize them, didn't know what Iron Saints meant, didn't know what president meant, but she recognized the archetype. A man in leather on her porch at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning was a category of trouble she didn't want. "Noah!" she screamed without turning. The sound was raw, cracked, a voice that had been screaming into empty rooms for years. "Get down here!" Footsteps on stairs. The door opened wider. Noah appeared behind his mother, taller than her by 4 inches, wearing the same clothes he'd had on that morning. His face was gray with fatigue, and his eyes had the hollow, unfocused look of someone who'd been staring at a phone screen for 3 hours, waiting for it to tell him what to do. "Hey," Gage said. "Hey. Walk with me." Noah looked at his mother. She'd already turned back toward the living room, toward the television, toward whatever anesthetic she'd constructed against the morning. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't ask where he was going. Didn't look back. Noah stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind him. The hinges whined. The screen door banged once in the wind. They walked. Gage didn't lead him to the bike. Didn't want to put a 16-year-old on the back of a Harley in broad daylight on a residential street. They walked east toward the end of Caldwell Avenue, where a small park occupied the corner lot. The park had a bench, a dead swing set, and a basketball hoop with no net. Nobody was there. Nobody was ever there. They sat. Gage didn't speak for 30 seconds. He let the silence establish itself, not as discomfort, but as permission. Permission for the boy to talk when he was ready, or to not talk at all. Noah broke first. "Who was in that truck?" "A man named Vincent Cray." "Who is he?" "Someone I used to know, someone dangerous. Why is he watching me? He's not watching you, not originally. He was watching the youth center, watching a woman named Claire Bennett. Miss Bennett, the counselor? Gage looked at him. You know her. Yeah. She runs the tutoring program. She helped me with my college essay last month. A pause. Something moved behind Noah's eyes. A connection forming, wires touching. Why would someone be watching her? Gage told him. Not everything. Not the warehouse fire. Not the Iron Saints' involvement. Not the guilt that had metastasized inside his chest for 7 years. But enough. Claire's husband. The financial records. The foundation. The man in the truck looking for something hidden in a dead man's belongings. Noah listened the way survivors listen, without interruption, without visible reaction, absorbing information the way dry ground absorbs rain, taking everything in and letting nothing back out. And me? Noah said when Gage finished. Why do they have my picture? Because you noticed the truck. You talked about it in the coffee shop. And someone heard? No, the truck was already watching. When you started stopping, looking, changing your pattern, they noticed. You became a variable. Variables get documented. A variable? Noah's voice was flat. Like in math. Like in survival. Noah looked at the dead swing set. The chains hung motionless in the still air, rusted at the joints, links frozen together by years of rain and neglect. A swing set nobody had used, in a park nobody visited, in a neighborhood nobody invested in. I don't have anyone, Noah said quietly. You know that, right? My mom isn't going to do anything. The school won't do anything. I could disappear tomorrow, and it'd be 3 days before anyone noticed. The words hit Gage like a hammer strike to the sternum, not because they were dramatic, because they were delivered with the calm, measured accuracy of a boy who had run the calculation already and was simply reporting the result. You called me, Gage said, because there's nobody else. That's not nothing. Noah looked at him, 16 years old, eyes that had been old since he was 12. A jaw set in the same position Gage had seen on soldiers who'd run out of options but hadn't run out of fight. What happens now? Noah asked. Now I go talk to Claire Bennett, and you stay with Decker. The guy in the black truck. Yeah. Is he like you? He's better than me, in every way that matters. Noah almost smiled, not quite. The ghost of a smile, visible for a quarter second in the corner of his mouth before it disappeared like smoke and wind. Gage stood, his knees cracked, his back ached. 39 hours without real sleep and counting. Noah. The boy looked up. I don't make promises. Promises are debt you might not be able to pay. But I'm telling you, I see you. And that truck is not going to park outside your house again. He turned and walked back toward Caldwell Avenue. Decker's truck was still there. Gage stopped at the driver's window. Decker lowered it. Kid stays in your sight until I call. Copy. Where are you going? Maynard Street, the youth center. Alone? Yeah. Gage. Decker's voice carried a weight that stopped Gage mid-step. Harlan called me 20 minutes ago. He reached the Port Ellison chapter. And? Cray didn't come back on his own. The Whitfield Foundation isn't dead. It restructured. New name, new board, new money. But the same people at the top. But Gage stood very still. There's more, Decker said. His cigarette had gone out and he hadn't relit it, a sign that whatever came next was bad enough to break routine. The Port Ellison brothers did some digging. The new foundation has a legal team, and that legal team's senior partner, the one managing the trust that leased Cray's truck, has a client list. Get to it. The client list includes a name we know, someone who was at our table last night. The words entered Gage's body like a bullet, not with pain, not immediately, but with the strange, suspended sensation of impact before the damage registers, the half second between the hit and the hurt. The moment where your brain knows something catastrophic has happened, but your nervous system hasn't caught up. Who? Gage said. Decker looked at him through the cracked window. His face was a landscape of conflict, loyalty wrestling with truth, brotherhood wrestling with betrayal, the instinct to protect his president wrestling with the obligation to inform him. Pike. Pike. The lighter. The nervous fidgeting. The 2 missing fingers from Fallujah. The man who'd sat at the table last night clicking his lighter open and shut, open and shut, while Gage laid out the operation plan. Pike, who had access to every safe house location the Iron Saints maintained. Pike, who knew the rotation schedules, the communication frequencies, the encrypted channel protocols. Pike, who had heard Gage announce that the club would be placing surveillance teams on Maynard Street starting at 5 a.m., which meant Cray already knew. Cray knew they were watching. Cray knew their positions. Cray knew their timing. And Cray knew, because Pike had sat at that table and heard every word, that the Iron Saints president was personally invested in protecting a woman and a boy who were both now exposed. Gage's phone buzzed. A text from Rowan. Two of the Maynard Street surveillance brothers just checked in. The blue pickup isn't on Maynard. It's not on any route we're covering. It's gone. And Pike's phone went dark at 8:45 a.m. GPS last pinged heading south on Route 9, the same road where Ethan Bennett had died 3 years ago in a single-vehicle accident on a clear night. Gage looked at Decker. Decker looked back. Between them, in the space where cigarette smoke usually hung, there was nothing but cold October air and the sound of a boy sitting alone in a dead park 4 houses away, waiting for someone to tell him whether the world was about to get better or immeasurably worse. "Call Harlan," Gage said. His voice had changed. Not louder, not harder. Something had dropped out of it. The restraint, the measured cadence, the careful architecture of a man who'd spent 4 years leading by patience and calculation. What remained was something older, rawer. The voice of the soldier underneath the president, the man who'd learned, in a desert 10,000 miles from the street, that there comes a moment when watching is no longer possible, and the only options left are move or die. Tell him he was right. Tell him I was wrong. And tell him to bring every brother within 50 miles to Ridgemont by nightfall. And Pike? Gage's hand closed into a fist. The scar on his right knuckle stretched. The gear oil in the creases of his palm had dried to a dark residue that looked, in the gray October light, exactly like old blood. Pike made his choice. Now I make mine. He mounted the Harley, kicked the engine to life. The sound split the quiet street like a detonation, raw and deep and angry, and the vibration traveled through the frame into his chest cavity and settled there like a second heartbeat, faster, harder, relentless. He pulled out of Caldwell Avenue and turned west toward Maynard Street, toward the youth center, toward a woman who didn't know that the wooden box on her shelf was worth killing for, that the husband she'd mourned for 3 years had died for it, and that the man who'd ordered his death was now less than 20 miles away, moving south on the same road, with a traitor in his pocket and a list of names that no longer included the word surveillance. The list now had only 2 categories: retrieve and eliminate, and Claire Bennett's name was on both. Gage reached Maynard Street in 4 minutes. He rode the Harley straight onto the sidewalk in front of the youth center, killed the engine, and was off the bike before the exhaust pipe stopped ticking. The tutoring sign still hung on the glass door. The rubber doorstop was in place. Inside, fluorescent light spilled across a linoleum floor that had been mopped recently enough to smell like pine cleaner. He pushed through the door. The youth center's main room was an open space, folding tables arranged in clusters, mismatched chairs, a bookshelf along the far wall stuffed with paperbacks and binders, a whiteboard with a schedule written in blue marker. Crayon drawings were pinned to a corkboard near the entrance. A coffee maker sat on a card table in the corner, the pot half full and the warming light still on. Claire Bennett was standing at the whiteboard, erasing a section with the side of her hand. She turned when the door banged shut behind Gage, and her expression cycled through 3 phases in less than 2 seconds: surprise, assessment, alarm. Her eyes went to the leather jacket, the patches, the size of him filling the door frame, the oil stains on his hands, the look on his face, which was not the look of a man who had come for tutoring. "We're not open for another hour," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled, but her right hand had dropped to her side, and Gage noticed her fingers brush the edge of the table beside her, not reaching for anything, just confirming the table's position. Establishing an exit route. Measuring distance. She'd learned that somewhere, not from a self-defense class. From life. "Claire Bennett? Who's asking?" "My name is Gage Callahan. I run a motorcycle club called the Iron Saints. I know that means nothing to you, but you need to listen to what I'm about to say, and you need to listen now, because we don't have time for me to earn your trust first." She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes stayed locked on his, brown eyes, clear, intelligent, carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who have been carrying weight alone for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "There's a man named Vincent Cray," Gage said. "He's been watching this building for 2 weeks, sitting in a blue pickup truck across the street every morning. He's looking for something your husband hid before he died. Financial records. Evidence of a criminal operation that laundered millions through a foundation your husband worked for." Claire's face didn't change. But something behind it did. A shift in pressure, like a window cracking in a storm. Not breaking. Not yet. But the structural integrity had changed, and they both knew it. "My husband was an accountant," she said carefully. "He worked for nonprofits. One of those nonprofits was a front. He found out. He copied the evidence. And then he died on Route 9 3 years ago in an accident that wasn't an accident." Now her face changed. The blood left it in a wave, starting at her cheeks and moving outward until her lips were the color of the whiteboard behind her. Her hand gripped the edge of the table. Not for an exit road anymore. For balance. "Get out. Claire, get out of my building. The man who killed your husband is 20 miles from here right now. He's been watching you for 12 days. He's already targeted a 16-year-old kid who walks past this building every morning. He knows where you live. He knows your schedule. And within 24 hours, he's going to stop watching and start acting. You don't know what you're talking about. Your husband bought a wooden memory box 2 weeks before he died. Handcrafted. Paid cash. Picked it up from a furniture maker in Grayfield. It's in your house right now. On a shelf, in a closet, somewhere you've kept it because it was his and you couldn't let it go." Gage's voice didn't soften. He couldn't afford soft right now. Soft was a luxury that existed on the other side of a clock that was running out. Inside that box is a drive or a set of documents that contains every financial transaction, every account number, every name connected to the organization that killed him. That's what Cray is looking for. That's why he's here. And that's why you need to come with me right now. Claire stared at him. Her breathing had gone shallow, rapid, controlled, the breathing of someone fighting the urge to either scream or collapse. Her fingers were white on the table edge. "I don't know you," she whispered. "I don't know anything about you. You walk into my building with gang patches on your jacket and tell me my husband was murdered, and I'm supposed to just... These aren't gang patches." Gage's voice dropped. Not in volume, in register, into the place where words stop being arguments and become something heavier. Every man who wears this patch served overseas. Every one of them came home broken. Every one of them was failed by the same system that's failing you right now. The system that ruled your husband's death an accident without investigating. That let a known criminal sit outside your building for 2 weeks without a single cop noticing. That's going to send a patrol car to your house 72 hours after you're already gone. The word gone hung in the air between them like a held blade. Claire's eyes filled. She didn't cry. She held it. The way she'd been holding everything for 3 years. The grief, the questions, the late-night moments when something about Ethan's death felt wrong, but she couldn't name it, couldn't shape it, couldn't find anyone willing to listen. "The box," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "It's on the mantle, in my living room. I see it every day. I thought he made it for me." "He did, and he hid something inside it to protect you. By making me a target. By trusting that someday someone would come who could use what he saved. He just didn't live long enough to be that person." Claire released the table. She stood straight, her shoulders pulled back in a motion that looked less like courage and more like a reflex, the body's automatic response to a world that had just been reordered without permission. "My brother," she said. "Marcus. He's at school." "Which school?" "Ridgemont Middle. He gets out at 3:15. Gage checked his phone. 10:02 a.m. 5 hours. "I'll have someone at the school by noon." "Who? More bikers?" "Veterans, fathers, men who know what it looks like when a kid needs protecting." Claire grabbed her jacket from the back of a chair. She was moving now, fast, decisive. The paralysis replaced by a momentum that Gage recognized because he'd seen it in combat. The moment when fear stops being an obstacle and becomes fuel. They were out the door in 45 seconds. Gage put her on the back of the Harley. She didn't hesitate, didn't adjust. wrapped her arms around his midsection and held on with the grip strength of a woman who'd spent 3 years holding her world together with nothing but her own 2 hands. The ride to Claire's house took 6 minutes. Gage pushed the Harley through residential streets at speeds that made stop signs into suggestions and yield signs into memories. Claire's house was a modest bungalow on Orchard Lane. White siding, green shutters, a front yard with a bicycle leaning against the porch rail that belonged to Marcus. They went inside. Claire moved through the living room without pausing, past the couch, past the photographs on the wall, past every artifact of a life that had been built on a foundation she was only now discovering was cracked, and stopped at the fireplace mantel. The memory box sat between a framed photograph of Ethan and a small ceramic vase that held dried flowers. It was beautiful. Walnut, hand-joined, with an inlaid geometric pattern on the lid that caught the light from the window. The kind of object that existed in the overlap between art and function, crafted by someone who understood that the most important things deserve beautiful containers. Claire picked it up. Her hands trembled. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, heavier than it should have been, heavier than an empty box, heavier than memory alone could account for. She opened it. Inside, resting on a lining of dark velvet, was a USB drive. Black, unmarked, no larger than a thumb. Beneath the drive, a folded piece of paper. Claire unfolded it with fingers that shook so badly the paper rattled against itself. Gage stood behind her and read over her shoulder. The note was handwritten. Ethan Bennett's handwriting. She would know it anywhere. The cramped left-handed slant. The way he crossed his T's with a long horizontal stroke that always looked rushed. Claire. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. The drive contains everything, every transaction, every name, every account. The foundation is not what it seems. Don't go to local police. Don't trust anyone connected to the county legal system. Find someone outside the network. Someone with nothing to lose. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry for all of it. Ethan. Claire's knees buckled. Not dramatically, not a collapse, not a faint. A slow fold, like a structure settling under weight it was never designed to carry. She went down onto the edge of the couch and sat there with the note in one hand and the USB drive in the other, and stared at a point on the carpet that had no significance except that it was the only thing in the room that wasn't trying to destroy her. Gage gave her 10 seconds. That was all he could afford. Claire, we need to go. She looked up. Her face was wet. She hadn't made a sound. The tears had come silently, the way they come for people who learned long ago that crying out loud doesn't bring help. He knew, she said. He knew they were going to kill him. Yes. And he didn't run. He hid the evidence. He wrote you the note. He put it somewhere only you would keep. And then he drove home on Route 9 and they ran him off the road. Gage didn't answer. Some truths don't need confirmation. They just need a witness. Claire stood. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She put the USB drive in her jacket pocket and zipped it shut. The note she folded and placed back in the box, and the box she set back on the mantel, exactly where it had been, as if by preserving its position she could hold the last 3 years in place for just a little longer. Let's go, she said. Gage's phone rang as they stepped onto the porch. Decker. Noah's gone. 2 words. The worst 2 words in any language. What do you mean gone? I was parked on Caldwell. Kid was in the house. His mother came outside at 10:40, got in a car, drove to the liquor store on 5th. I stayed on the house. At 11:15 I knocked. No answer. Checked the back. Kitchen door was open. Kid's not inside. His backpack is gone and his phone is on the kitchen table. Gage's hand tightened on the phone. The plastic case creaked. He left his phone? On the table, screen up, open to the camera roll. What's in the camera roll? The pictures he took this morning, the truck, the passenger, the photograph of himself. A pause. And one new image, taken at 10:52. A text message on a burner phone that isn't his. What does it say? Decker's voice went flat. The kind of flat that soldiers use when they're reading something that makes them want to put their fist through a wall. It says, "We have your photograph and your school schedule. Walk to the railroad bridge on Maynard Extension. Come alone. If you contact anyone, the woman at the youth center dies before sundown. Gage closed his eyes. 1 second. 2. Behind his eyelids, the world was dark and red and pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Heavy, fast, the percussion of a body preparing for something it had been trained for, but had hoped it would never have to do again. Noah had walked into a trap, voluntarily, because the message had threatened Claire. Because a 16-year-old boy with no one in his life had decided that the one adult who'd helped him with a college essay was worth more than his own safety. He hadn't called Gage, hadn't called Decker, hadn't called anyone, because the message said if he contacted anyone, Claire would die. And Noah, who had spent his entire life watching systems fail, watching adults disappear, watching promises dissolve like smoke, Noah had believed it. Of course he had. He had no reason not to. The railroad bridge, Gage said, that connects to the old freight depot on the south end of the rail yard. Yeah, Cray's using the depot. Has to be. It's the only structure out there with walls. Gage opened his eyes. Claire was standing beside him on the porch, reading his expression the way you read weather. Not the details, but the direction. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew it was bad. The only question was the shape of it. The boy, she said. Noah. They took him. Or he went to them. Same result. Because of me. Because of the evidence. Because of Cray. Because of 100 decisions made by 100 people over 7 years, none of which are your fault. But he went because of me. Gage didn't argue. There wasn't time to argue. And she wasn't wrong. The chain of causation ran through her, whether she'd chosen it or not. The same way it ran through Gage. The same way it ran through a dead man who'd hidden a USB drive in a handmade box and driven home on Route 9 knowing he might not arrive. Give me the drive, Gage said. No. Claire, this is what they want. If I give it to you and they take it, Noah dies for nothing. Ethan died for nothing. If you keep it and they take you, the same thing happens. Then they don't take me. She said it with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from the absence of alternatives. The bedrock stubbornness of a woman who had buried her husband, raised her brother, built a youth center from nothing, and held every fracture in her life together with willpower and duct tape, and the refusal to break down until the work was done. Gage looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he called Harlan. Where are you? 40 minutes out. Got 11 brothers with me. More coming. The freight depot. South end of the Ridgemont rail yard. Cray's there. He's got the kid. The kid from the coffee shop? Yeah. How many with Cray? Unknown. At least 2. Could be more. Pike's been feeding him information since last night, so assume he knows our numbers, our communication channels, and our approach patterns. Pike. Harlan's voice carried something that went beyond anger. A cold, tectonic fury. The kind that doesn't burn, but crushes. I'll deal with Pike. First we get the kid, then we deal with Pike. Give me the layout. The depot is a complex. 4 buildings. Main warehouse is corrugated steel, 60 by 100. Loading dock on the north face. 2 smaller outbuildings on the east side. Old offices. Maybe storage. Rail spur runs along the west wall with 3 freight cars that haven't moved in years. The approach is open ground from every direction except the south, where the tree line runs within 50 yards of the back wall. South approach. Through the trees. That's what I'd do. But Cray knows it too, if Pike gave him the layout. Then we give him something to look at from the north while we come through the south. That's the play. Gage, Harlan's voice changed. The fury was still there, but something else had surfaced beneath it. The thing that Harlan never showed and never named, but that every man in the club recognized because they carried it too. Loyalty. Not the easy kind, the kind you talk about at barbecues and in bar toasts. The kind that costs something. The kind that bleeds. I gave you a hard time at church. I was wrong about some of it. Not all of it, but some. I know. This is the part where you're right and I'm wrong. We're going to get that kid, and then we're going to finish this. The line went dead. Gage turned to Claire. You're staying with Decker. No. This isn't negotiable. The hell it isn't. That boy walked into a trap because a message told him I would die if he didn't. I'm not sitting in a truck while someone else fixes that. You want the drive? I carry it. I walk in there. I make the trade. There is no trade. They'll take the drive and kill you both. Then I walk in as a distraction while your men come through the trees. Gage stared at her. Behind him, the Harley ticked as the engine cooled. Down the street, a dog barked twice and went silent. A cloud moved across the sun, and the light dimmed, turning the world gray and flat, the color of concrete, the color of war. You've never done anything like this. I've never had to. If something goes wrong, something already went wrong 3 years ago on Route 9. Everything since then has been me pretending it didn't. Gage called Decker. Change of plan. Bring the truck to Orchard Lane. We're moving to the depot. Who's we? All of us. Gage, the woman shouldn't... She's made her decision, and she's right. He ended the call. The afternoon was bleeding away. The temperature had dropped 6 degrees in the last hour, and the sky had the heavy, leaden quality that promised rain before nightfall. Somewhere south of town, in a rusting freight depot surrounded by dead rail lines and empty fields, a 16-year-old boy was sitting in darkness with his wrists bound, listening to men discuss whether he was more useful alive or dead. And somewhere on a highway between Colton and Ridgemont, 11 motorcycles rode in formation through the failing light. Heavy machines on cold asphalt, headlights cutting the gray air like surgical instruments, the combined sound of their engines building into a wall of noise that made the roadside trees vibrate and sent deer bolting through the underbrush and caused a woman hanging laundry in her backyard to stop, straighten, and stare at the road with a hand pressed to her chest. Because the sound wasn't just loud. It was the sound of something inevitable coming to collect what was owed. By 5 p.m., they were staged in the tree line south of the freight depot. 14 Iron Saints, Gage, Decker, Harlan, 11 brothers who had ridden through the afternoon and dismounted in a farmer's unused pasture half a mile south, walking the rest of the way through scrub pine and dead grass, carrying nothing but what they wore and the certainty that the next 2 hours would either save a boy's life or end several of their own. Claire was with Decker, 50 yards back, sitting in the black truck on a fire access road that dead-ended at the tree line. She had the USB drive in her jacket pocket. Her hand hadn't left the zipper since they arrived. Gage lay on his stomach at the tree line's edge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The freight depot spread before him in the fading light. The main warehouse, its corrugated walls stained with rust and bird waste, loading dock doors closed, a single light burning inside that leaked through gaps in the metal siding like a wound glowing from within. The 2 outbuildings to the east. The rail spur with 3 dead freight cars on the west side, their wheels locked with oxidation, graffiti fading on their flanks. The blue pickup was parked inside the loading dock. He could see the tailgate through a gap in the door. A second vehicle, a dark sedan, make and model unidentifiable, sat beside it. Movement. A figure crossed between the outbuilding and the warehouse. Then another, armed. Not military posture, private security maybe, or hired contractors. The kind of men who worked for money, not conviction, which made them predictable in some ways and dangerous in others. I count 3, Harlan whispered beside him. He'd crawled up without making a sound, a trick that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size, but was, because Harlan had spent 14 months crawling through places where sound meant death. At least 3. Could be more inside. Pike? Don't see him. If he's in there, he's mine. Gage didn't argue. Some debts had only one acceptable collector. Rowan, Gage said into the short-range radio clipped to his collar. North side, what do you see? Rowan's voice came back thin and static-laced. He was positioned 400 yards north on the roof of an abandoned signal tower with a pair of night vision binoculars and a scanner tuned to local frequencies. Loading dock has 1 roll-up door partially raised. Interior is partially visible. I see the kid. He's seated, hands behind his back, center of the warehouse floor. 1 man standing near him. Can't confirm identity from this angle. Cray? Possible, build matches, can't confirm face. Any comms traffic? Nothing on local bands. They're using cells or encrypted radios. Gage checked his watch. 5:47 p.m., sundown in 20 minutes. Once darkness fell, the advantage shifted. The Iron Saints knew this ground better than anyone inside that warehouse, and darkness was where veterans did their best work. But darkness also meant Noah's captors would feel the clock running out. And desperate men with a hostage don't negotiate when the sun goes down. They accelerate. "We go now," Gage said. Harlan nodded. "Decker." "Here." The radio crackled. "Bring Claire to the north access road. Park visible. Headlights on. I want them looking north." "She's ready." "Tell her to stay in the truck until I signal, no matter what she hears." "Copy." "All brothers, south approach, two-man teams, staggered entry through the back wall. There's a maintenance access point 20 yards east of the southwest corner, corrugated panel that's been loose since the place shut down. First team breaches through there. Second team flanks east to the outbuildings. Third team holds the perimeter. Nobody fires unless fired on. The kid is the priority. Everything else is secondary." 11 voices acknowledged, quiet, clipped. The sound of men switching from civilians to operators. A transition that took less than a second because it was never fully off, never completely dormant, just buried under layers of daily life that peeled away the moment the radio crackled and the mission became real. Gage rose to a crouch. His knees ached, his back screamed. 43 hours without sleep, and the fatigue had become its own kind of clarity. The world reduced to essential elements, all nuance stripped away, leaving only targets and obstacles and the narrow corridor of action between them. He moved through the trees, Harlan beside him, 2 brothers behind. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and they made almost no sound, just the faint compression of wet foliage under boot soles and the whisper of leather against brush. The warehouse's back wall rose before them, 30 feet of corrugated steel, pocked with rust, seams weeping brown water from recent rain. The loose panel was where Gage remembered it, buckled outward at the bottom, leaving a gap wide enough for a man to slide through on his belly. Gage went first. The interior was dark, except for a work light hanging from a ceiling beam near the center of the space. The light threw a harsh white circle on the concrete floor, maybe 20 feet in diameter, and everything outside that circle was shadow. Deep, impenetrable shadow, the kind that breathed. Noah sat in the center of the light. Metal chair. Wrists zip-tied behind his back. His face was pale, his lips cracked, his eyes wide and fixed on a point straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had passed through fear and come out the other side into a territory that had no name. He was alive. He was conscious. And he was absolutely, completely terrified in a way that he would never fully admit to anyone, ever, because that was who Noah Mercer was, a boy who carried everything and showed nothing. A man stood 5 feet to Noah's left. Tall, lean, black jacket, no insignia. A holstered weapon visible on his right hip. He was talking into a phone, voice low, words inaudible. A second man leaned against the loading dock wall near the blue pickup, arms crossed, watching the warehouse door, watching the road beyond it. And there, standing just outside the circle of light, half in shadow, half illuminated, face carved into planes of white and black by the work light's harsh geometry, was Vincent Cray, 7 years older, 7 years thinner. 7 years of whatever underground existence he'd maintained between then and now, etched into the hollows of his cheeks and the dead flatness of his eyes. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, motionless, watching Noah the way a man watches something he's already decided to discard, with patience, with detachment, with the calm certainty that the outcome has already been determined, and the only remaining variable is timing. Gage's heart rate was 132 beats per minute. He knew because he could feel each one, in his throat, in his temples, in the scar on his right hand that pulsed like it had its own circulatory system. Headlights swept across the loading dock from the north. Decker's truck. High beams. The 2 men near the dock reacted, turning, reaching, the armed one moving toward the door. Now. Gage stood up from behind a rusted forklift and walked into the light. "Cray!" The name echoed off steel walls and concrete floor and came back distorted, stretched, a ghost of itself returning from every direction. Vincent Cray turned, slowly. The way a man turns when he's already calculated every possible interruption and assigned each one a probability and a response. His eyes found Gage, and something moved behind them. Not surprise, not fear, but recognition. The flat clinical recognition of a man identifying a variable he'd accounted for. "Callahan," Cray said. His voice was dry, colorless, the voice of someone who had stopped performing emotion so long ago that the mechanism had atrophied. I wondered when you'd show. Let the kid go. The kid walked in voluntarily, because you threatened a woman to get him here. I made a practical communication. He made a choice. Free will is a beautiful thing. Free will. Gage took one step forward. His boots on the concrete sounded like a door closing. You want to talk about free will? Let's talk about Ethan Bennett's free will when you ran him off Route 9. Craig's expression didn't change. Not a muscle. Not a flicker. I don't know what you're referring to. Let the kid go, and we can discuss the drive. For the first time, something shifted in Craig's face. A micro-movement, the barest tightening around the eyes, the faintest forward tilt of his head. The word drive had landed exactly where Gage intended, in the gap between Craig's control and his need. You have it? Craig said. I know where it is. That's not the same thing. It's close enough for this conversation. Noah's head had turned. He was looking at Gage with an expression that Gage had seen before. On young soldiers in the field, on brothers at the table, on every person who had ever been trapped in a situation they couldn't escape and had suddenly seen someone standing between them and the worst-case scenario. Not hope exactly. Something raw, the biological recognition of an ally in a hostile environment. Craig's armed man had stopped moving toward the loading dock. He was looking at Craig, waiting for instructions, his hand resting on his holster, but not drawing. The second man by the dock had shifted position, angling toward the back of the warehouse, toward the shadows where Harlan and two Iron Saints brothers were crouched in darkness, invisible, waiting. Here's what happens, Gage said. His voice was level, controlled. The soldier's voice. The voice that had talked men through ambushes and medevacs and the worst moments of their lives. You release the kid. He walks out through that loading dock. When he's clear, when I have visual confirmation that he's safe, I tell you where the drive is. You take it, you leave. We never see each other again. Craig studied him. 10 seconds. 15. The work light hummed. Rain had started outside. The first drops hitting the corrugated roof with a sound like fingertips tapping steel. Irregular, accelerating, building toward a downpour that would turn the rail yard into mud. You're lying, Craig said. You don't have the drive. If you did, you'd have brought it as leverage. The fact that you're offering information instead of the object means someone else has it. The woman. She's here, isn't she? Gage didn't answer. His silence was its own confirmation, and they both knew it. Craig's hand came out of his jacket pocket. In it was a phone. He held it up, screen facing Gage. Pike has been very informative, Craig said. I know your numbers. I know your positions. I know you have men in the tree line to the south and a truck parked on the north access road. He tilted the screen. I also know something you don't. He pressed a button. The phone's speaker activated. A voice. Pike's voice, tight with adrenaline, carrying the specific tremor of a man who had crossed a line and couldn't find his way back, filled the warehouse. Gage, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, brother. They have my daughter. They've had her since last week. I didn't have a choice. I didn't. Cray ended the call. The silence that followed was absolute. Rain hammered the roof. The work light swung slightly on its chain, casting shadows that moved across the floor like slow-motion predators. His daughter, Cray said, 14 years old, currently sitting in a very comfortable room in a very secure location. She'll be released unharmed the moment I have the drive. Or she won't be released at all. The mechanics of that outcome depend entirely on what happens in the next 5 minutes. Gage's vision narrowed. The edges of the warehouse blurred. The center, Cray, Noah, the circle of light, sharpened to a resolution so intense it felt like looking through a rifle scope. Every detail crystallized. The grain of Cray's jacket, the zip tie cutting into Noah's wrists, the faint trace of dried tears on the boy's cheeks that he would deny until the day he died. Pike's daughter, 14 years old. A girl Gage had watched grow up at club barbecues, a girl who called him Uncle Gage, a girl whose laughter sounded like something the world had almost forgotten how to make. Another hostage, another innocent, another piece on a board that Cray had been arranging for weeks while Gage was still trying to understand the game. And somewhere in the shadows behind him, Harlan was listening. Harlan, who had argued for action over patience. Harlan, who had been right. Harlan, who was now hearing that the man he'd sat next to at the table, the man whose lighter had clicked open and shut through the entire meeting, had been compromised not by greed or ideology, but by the most devastating leverage imaginable: his child. Gage heard a sound behind him, faint, nearly inaudible under the rain, the sound of a man shifting position in the dark, not to retreat, but to advance. Harlan was moving, and outside, through the loading dock gap, headlights flashed twice. Decker's signal. Claire was out of the truck. She was walking toward the warehouse. She had the drive in her pocket and the look on her face. The look Gage had seen on the porch. The look of a woman who had stopped pretending the world was safe. And she was walking straight into the light. The armed man saw her first, drew his weapon, aimed at the dock opening. Noah screamed. Not a word, not a name. A raw animal sound. The sound of a 16-year-old boy watching the only adult who had ever helped him walk toward a man holding a gun. Gage's hand found the heavy steel wrench he'd pulled from the forklift's toolbox when no one was watching. His fingers closed around it. The metal was cold. The weight was familiar. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. 2 armed men, 1 wrench, 14 brothers in the shadows, 1 boy in a chair, 1 woman in the doorway, and 5 seconds before the geometry of the room collapsed into chaos. He looked at Noah. Noah looked back at him. And in that look, silent, unbroken, the compressed language of 2 people who had both spent their lives being invisible and were now standing in the brightest light either of them had ever known. Something passed between them. Not a plan, not a signal. Permission. Gage threw the wrench. The wrench hit the armed man's wrist with a sound like a tree branch snapping in a winter storm, a wet, structural crack that was part bone and part tendon and entirely final. The gun discharged as it left his hand, the shot punching through the corrugated ceiling and sending a shower of rust flakes down through the work light's beam, like orange snow. The weapon skittered across the concrete floor and disappeared into the shadows beneath a rusted conveyor frame. Everything happened in the next 4 seconds. Harlan came out of the darkness behind the forklift like something the warehouse itself had produced. Massive, silent, moving with a speed that contradicted his size, the way a landslide contradicts the stillness of the mountain before it. He hit the second man at the loading dock with a tackle that drove both of them into the blue pickup's tailgate, hard enough to dent the metal. The man's head bounced off the steel bed, and his body went slack, and Harlan was already standing over him before the echo of impact faded. 2 brothers breached through the loose panel at the back wall. 2 more came through a side door that had been chained from the outside until 60 seconds ago, when a man named Torres, former Marine combat engineer, current Iron Saint Sergeant-at-Arms, had cut the chain with bolt cutters so quietly that the metal links separated without a sound. The warehouse filled with bodies, not chaos, choreography. The ugly, imperfect choreography of men who had trained for room clearance in places where the consequences of failure were measured in flag-draped caskets. Gage didn't watch the breach. He was already moving toward Noah. The boy was still in the chair, hands zip-tied behind his back, his scream still hanging in the air like a vibration the room couldn't absorb. His eyes were locked on Claire, who stood in the loading dock opening with rain soaking her jacket and her hair plastered to her face, and her hand pressed against her pocket where the drive sat like a heart she was trying to keep from being torn out. Gage reached Noah in 3 strides. He pulled a folding knife from his boot, a blade he'd carried for 11 years, through 2 deployments and 1,000 miles of highway and every day since, and cut the zip ties with a single motion. The plastic fell away. Noah's wrists were raw, red welts where the ties had bitten into skin, blood beading in thin lines where the edges had cut through during hours of unconscious pulling. "Get up," Gage said. Noah stood, his legs buckled. Gage caught him, one hand on the boy's arm, one hand on his back, and held him upright with the kind of grip that doesn't ask permission and doesn't let go. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." "Then walk, toward Claire. Don't stop." Noah moved, stiff, unsteady, but moving, 1 foot in front of the other across 20 feet of concrete that felt like 20 miles. Claire met him at the loading dock. She didn't speak. She put both arms around him and pulled him against her and held him the way you hold something you almost lost. Too tight, too desperate, with the full knowledge that your hands are the only thing between this person and an abyss that nearly swallowed them whole. Noah didn't resist. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, he let someone hold him without calculating the cost. Gage turned back. The warehouse floor had settled into a new geometry. Harlan's man was down and still. The armed man with the broken wrist was on his knees, cradling his hand against his chest, his face gray with shock. Torres and two brothers had him contained, not touching him, just standing close enough that the implication was absolute. But Cray was gone. The space where he'd stood, just outside the circle of light, half in shadow, was empty. Gage's eyes swept the warehouse. Dark corners, stacked pallets, the conveyor frame, the forklift, the freight cars visible through the west wall's loading bay. Cray moved. Rowan's voice crackled through the radio from the signal tower. West side, through the loading bay. He's in the rail yard, heading for the freight cars. Gage ran. The loading bay opened onto the rail spur, 3 rusted freight cars on a dead track, their massive steel frames silhouetted against a sky that was now fully dark, clouds low and swollen, rain falling in sheets that turned the gravel between the rails into a shallow river. The work light's glow reached maybe 10 feet past the bay opening before the darkness swallowed it. Gage stopped at the bay edge, let his eyes adjust. The rain was cold, not just cold but penetrating, the kind of October rain that finds the gaps in leather and denim and reaches skin and stays there, drawing heat out of the body 1 degree at a time. Movement. Between the second and third freight cars, a shadow separating from the larger darkness and moving south along the track bed. Cray. Moving fast but controlled, feet finding the railroad ties with the precision of a man who'd planned his escape route before the first hostage was taken. Gage went after him. The footing was terrible. Wet gravel, rotting ties, standing water in the gaps between rails. Gage's boots slipped twice. His right knee hit a tie edge and pain flared up his thigh like an electrical current. He kept moving. The rain hammered his shoulders and blurred his vision and filled his ears with white noise that made it impossible to hear footsteps ahead. He rounded the third freight car and found Cray standing at the end of the spur. Not running. Standing. Facing Gage. 20 feet of wet gravel between them. The rail spur dead-ended at a concrete bumper block, beyond which the ground dropped into a drainage culvert that fed into the same system of ditches and channels that ran beneath the rail yard. There was nowhere left to go. Cray had run out of track. "It's over," Gage said. His voice was raw. Rain ran down his face and into his mouth and tasted like iron and cold earth. Cray's hands were at his sides. His jacket was soaked. His thin frame looked diminished in the rain, reduced, stripped of the composed authority he'd held inside the warehouse. But his eyes hadn't changed, still flat, still calculating, still running equations behind a face that gave nothing away. "Is it?" Cray said. "You have the drive. You have the boy. You have your brotherhood standing around feeling heroic, but you don't have the network. You don't have the men above me, and you don't have Pike's daughter." The words landed like a blade slipped between ribs. Not the force of impact, but the precise surgical placement designed to hit something vital. "Where is she?" Gage said. "Safe, for now, but the arrangement was simple. I deliver the drive. She goes home. If I don't deliver the drive, the arrangement changes." "You're going to tell me where she is?" "Why would I do that?" "Because it's the only thing you have left to trade." Cray studied him. Rain streamed down both their faces. The darkness was nearly complete, only the faint ambient glow from the warehouse behind Gage and the distant orange haze of Ridgemont streetlights against low clouds. "You know what I find interesting, Callahan? 7 years ago, you called the foundation trying to negotiate your club's exit. A reasonable call. A diplomatic call. And within 18 hours, your warehouse was burning." Cray paused. "You've carried that, I can see it. The guilt. The idea that your phone call triggered the retaliation." Gage didn't move. The rain filled the silence between them. "It didn't," Cray said. "The fire was already planned before you called. Your club was a liability the moment you started asking questions about where the money was going. The phone call changed nothing. The outcome was determined weeks before you picked up the receiver." The words hit Gage in a place he hadn't armored. The soft tissue beneath the scar, the wound under the wound, the 7-year-old certainty that he had caused the fire that put Sutton in a wheelchair and shattered the trust of every man at his table. He'd built his entire presidency on that guilt, the caution, the restraint, the refusal to move without complete information, all of it rooted in the belief that his one impulsive decision had cost his brothers everything. And now, standing in the rain at the end of a dead rail spur, the man who'd ordered the fire was telling him it didn't matter, that it was never his fault, that the weight he'd carried for 7 years was based on a lie he'd told himself because the truth, that he'd been powerless, that nothing he did would have changed the outcome, was somehow worse than the guilt. Gage felt something shift inside his chest, not breaking, not healing, rearranging, the way geological layers shift after an earthquake, not returning to their original position, but finding a new configuration that could bear weight differently. "The girl," Gage said. "Tell me where she is. And this ends without you getting hurt." "Without me getting hurt?" Cray almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of a smile, clinical, detached, the expression of a man who had spent so long behind layers of control that genuine emotion had become vestigial. "You're not going to hurt me, Callahan. You're not that kind of man. That's your strength and your limitation." "You're right. I'm not." Footsteps behind Gage. Heavy, steady. The sound of boots on wet gravel, each step deliberate, metronomic. The cadence of a man who had been walking toward this moment since he heard Pike's voice on that phone. Harlan stepped into the space beside Gage. His face was wet with rain and his beard dripped, and his eyes held something that Gage had never seen in them before. Not rage, not fury, not the hot combative energy that had defined every disagreement between them for 4 years. Something colder, quieter. The terminal patience of a man who has reached the end of his capacity for restraint and found, on the other side, not explosion, but stillness. "I am," Harlan said. Cray looked at Harlan. For the first time, the very first time in the entire night, something moved behind his flat eyes. Not fear exactly, recognition. The recognition of a man who has spent his career calculating human responses and has just encountered one he didn't account for. Harlan took one step forward. Just one. The gravel crunched under his boot with a sound like a knuckle cracking. "Pike's daughter," Harlan said. "Where?" "Kill me and you'll never—" "Nobody said kill. I said where." Cray's mouth opened, closed. His hands, which had been still at his sides, moved to his jacket pockets. Harlan's hand closed around Cray's wrist before the fingers reached the fabric. A grip so fast and so complete that Cray's entire body locked, frozen mid-motion like a paused frame. "I've done 4 things in my life that I'm not proud of," Harlan said. His voice was barely audible above the rain. "I've made peace with 3 of them. The 4th is what I'll do to you in the next 60 seconds if you don't answer me." Cray answered. The girl was in a rented house in Ashford, 38 miles east. 2 men, ground floor. She was unharmed but confined to a bedroom with a locked exterior door. Gage was on the radio before Cray finished speaking. "Rowan, Ashford, residential rental, 2 hostiles. Pike's daughter." "Address?" Cray gave it. Harlan's grip didn't loosen until the last syllable. "Colton Chapter Brothers are 30 minutes from Ashford," Rowan said. "I'll route them now. Tell them non-negotiable. The girl comes out first. Everything else is secondary." "Copy." Harlan released Cray's wrist. The man staggered backward half a step, caught himself on the bumper block, and stood there in the rain with his hand pressed to his wrist and his flat eyes finally showing something underneath the control. The dull animal recognition of a man who has run out of moves. Torres and 2 brothers appeared from the warehouse. They took Cray between them without violence. Firm hands on his arms, a controlled walk back toward the loading dock. The kind of professional detention that comes from training, not anger. Cray went without resistance. He had nothing left to resist with. Gage stood at the end of the rail spur. The rain was lessening, not stopping, just easing, the downpour thinning to a steady fall that no longer hammered, but whispered. Harlan stood beside him. Neither spoke for a full minute. "You heard what he said," Gage finally said. "About my phone call." "Yeah. 7 years I thought I caused the fire." "I know." "You knew?" I suspected. The way you led after that, all the caution, all the restraint, that wasn't strategy, Gage. That was penance. I could see it. I just didn't know what for. Why didn't you say something? Because you needed to carry it until you were ready to put it down. That's not something someone else can decide for you. Gage looked at Harlan. Rain ran between them. The darkness was absolute now, except for the warehouse light behind them and the faint distant glow of a town where a boy and a woman stood together in a loading dock, alive, breathing, holding each other in a way that neither of them had been held in years. I was wrong about the caution, Gage said. Sometimes. And you were wrong about the aggression. Sometimes. So what does that leave? Harlan wiped his face with the back of his hand. His beard shed water in a sheet. He looked at Gage with those unblinking eyes, eyes that had seen the same wars, carried the same losses, survived the same impossible mathematics of violence and mercy and the space between. It leaves the table, Harlan said. Same as always. They walked back to the warehouse. 47 minutes later, Rowan's voice came through the radio, clear, calm, the most beautiful words Gage had heard in 7 years. Girl is secure, unharmed. She's asking for her father. Pike, who had been sitting in the back of Decker's truck under Harlan's watch for the past 30 minutes, put his face in his 3-fingered hands and wept. Not quietly, not with the contained, performative grief that men sometimes use to signal emotion without actually surrendering to it. He wept the way a man weeps when the structure he's been holding together with terror and betrayal and desperate love finally gives way, and everything he's been holding back pours out at once, ugly, loud, uncontrollable, the sound of a father who has been carrying his daughter's life in his hands like a glass he was terrified to drop. Nobody comforted him. Nobody condemned him. The brothers stood in the rain and let him break because that was what he needed. Not forgiveness, not judgment, but the space to fall apart in the presence of men who understood what it meant to love something so much that you'd destroy everything else to protect it. Gage watched from the loading dock. Claire and Noah stood beside him. Noah had a blanket from Decker's truck around his shoulders, gray wool, smelling of engine oil and cigarettes, and he hadn't let go of Claire's arm since she'd pulled him from the chair. What happens to him? Noah asked, looking at Pike. That's not decided yet. He helped them. He told them everything. He did. Because of his daughter. Yeah? Noah was quiet for a moment. The rain dripped from the loading dock's overhang in a curtain of silver that caught the work light and turned it into a wall of liquid crystal. I would have done the same thing, Noah said. Gage looked at him, 16 years old, eyes that had been old since childhood, a jaw that had learned to set itself against the world before the world had given him any reason to trust it. I know you would have, Gage said. Does that make it okay? No. It makes it human. By midnight, the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Department had taken custody of Vincent Cray and his 2 associates. Gage made the call himself, not to the local police, but to a state investigator named Marsh, who owed Rowan a favor from a case 4 years ago that nobody talked about. Marsh arrived with 3 state vehicles and the kind of jurisdictional authority that made local politics irrelevant. The USB drive was handed over in the presence of Marsh, Claire, and a hastily summoned attorney from Barton Creek, who Claire had never met, but who Rowan had vetted in 30 minutes and confirmed was clean. The drive contained everything Ethan Bennett had promised: 14 months of financial records, transaction logs, account numbers, shell company registrations, board communications, and names. A cascade of names that connected the Whitfield Foundation to a network of organizations spread across 3 states, laundering money through children's charities and community grants, and after-school programs that existed on paper but served no children and granted no community anything except a mechanism for making dirty money look clean. Ethan Bennett, sitting alone in a home office 3 years ago, had copied all of it. Every document, every file, every thread of evidence that proved the operation's scope and identified its architects. He'd known what it would cost him. He'd written the note, he'd hidden the drive, and he'd driven home on Route 9 knowing that the men he was exposing would eventually find out what he'd done. They found out that same night. His car left the road at mile marker 17. The investigators ruled it an accident. Single vehicle. No witnesses, No evidence of foul play because the men who'd arranged it were professionals, and professionals don't leave evidence. But Ethan had, hidden in walnut and velvet, sitting on a mantel for 3 years, waiting for the day when someone would open it and understand. Claire stood in the parking lot outside the freight depot and watched the state vehicles pull away, their lights painting the wet gravel red and blue in alternating pulses. Her face was wet, rain and tears, and the residue of an exhaustion so deep it had become structural, woven into her posture, her breathing, the way she held her arms crossed against her chest, as if physically containing something that would scatter if she let go. "He didn't tell me," she said quietly. To no one. To the night. To the memory of a man who had loved her enough to protect her and had paid for that protection with everything. Gage stood beside her, not close, not far. The distance of a man who understood that some grief requires witness, not intervention. "He told you the only way he could," Gage said. "He left the truth where he knew you'd keep it safe, even if you didn't know what it was." Claire looked at him. Her eyes were red. Her face was raw. She looked like a woman who had been disassembled and was only beginning to understand the shape of what remained. "Thank you," she said. The words were small, nearly inaudible, carrying a weight that was inversely proportional to their size. "Don't thank me. Thank the kid who walked through a rail yard every morning and noticed what no one else did." Claire looked at Noah. He was sitting on the tailgate of Decker's truck, the gray blanket still around his shoulders, eating a granola bar that someone had produced from somewhere. He ate the way hungry teenagers eat, mechanically, completely, without awareness of anything except the immediate necessity of fuel. She walked over, sat beside him on the tailgate. Didn't say anything, just sat. Noah finished the granola bar, folded the wrapper into a small square, put it in his pocket. "My mom's probably still asleep," he said. "Probably," Claire said. "She won't know I was gone." "I know. That used to bother me." "Does it still?" Noah looked at the warehouse, at the Iron Saints brothers standing in small groups in the rain, talking in low voices, smoking, checking phones, doing the quiet work of men coming down from adrenaline and finding their way back to the ordinary rhythms of bodies that had been pushed to their limits. He looked at Gage, who stood alone near the loading dock with his phone to his ear, arranging things. Logistics, legal contacts, safe housing, the 100 invisible tasks that follow the visible act of rescue. "No," Noah said. "It doesn't bother me anymore." Claire put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into it. Not much, just slightly, the way a wall leans into a buttress, not collapsing, but acknowledging that support exists and accepting it without surrendering structural independence. The rain stopped at 1:14 a.m. The clouds thinned and broke apart, and for the first time in hours the sky showed through. Not stars, not yet, but the faintest lightning of the darkness that promised stars were still there, still burning, still holding their positions above a world that couldn't always see them. 3 weeks passed. The investigation expanded faster than anyone anticipated. Marsh's team followed the USB drive's data through 14 shell companies, 6 bank accounts, and a network of charitable organizations that stretched across the region. 11 individuals were indicted. 3 were arrested within the first week. The Whitfield Foundation's successor organization, which had restructured under a new name and continued its operations with the confidence of men who believed their architecture was impenetrable, collapsed in a single afternoon when federal agents arrived at its offices with warrants generated from Ethan Bennett's meticulous records. Vincent Cray cooperated, not out of conscience. He didn't have one, or if he did, it had atrophied beyond function years ago. He cooperated because cooperation was the only remaining move on his board, and men like Cray never stopped calculating, even when the calculations no longer led anywhere worth going. Pike's daughter came home the night of the rescue. She walked through her father's front door at 2:30 a.m. and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his 3-fingered hands folded in front of him and tears still drying on his face. She didn't know what had happened. Not the details, not the betrayal, the leverage, the phone call, the warehouse. She knew only that her father was crying and that she was home and that something terrible had almost happened, but hadn't. Pike turned in his patch 3 days later, walked into the clubhouse at 10 in the morning, set the leather on the table in front of Gage, and stood there without speaking. His lighter was in his pocket. He wasn't clicking it. Gage looked at the patch, looked at Pike. "You have a daughter to raise," Gage said. "Yeah." "Then go raise her." "Do I need to explain?" "No." Pike nodded, turned, walked to the door, stopped. "I would have died before I let them hurt her." "I know. That's the only reason you're walking out of here instead of being carried." Pike left. The door closed behind him. Gage picked up the patch, worn leather, fraying threads, the iron fist and chain insignia that had meant something different to every man who wore it. He folded it once and placed it in the filing cabinet in the back office, in a drawer marked with no label, alongside 2 other patches from brothers who had left under circumstances that never needed explaining twice. Marcus Bennett, Claire's 14-year-old brother, was placed under the state's protective supervision during the investigation. Claire fought for and received full custody within 2 weeks after Marcia's team confirmed that the threats against her had been neutralized. Marcus returned to Ridgemont Middle School on a Monday morning, dropped off by his sister, who watched him walk through the front doors and didn't start the car again until he was completely inside. Noah Mercer continued to walk through the rail yard every morning. Same route, same time, same torn backpack strap, same silence, same iron smell in the cold pre-dawn air. But one thing changed. On the first Monday after the freight depot, a black motorcycle was parked on Maynard Street when Noah emerged from the rail yard at 6:14 a.m. Gage sat on the bike, engine off, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from Bowman's. He handed one to Noah without speaking. They walked to the youth center together, sat on the bench outside, drank coffee in the dark. The next morning, Gage was there again. And the morning after that, he never explained why, never formalized it, never turned it into a lesson or a speech about protection or fatherhood or the obligations of men who have survived enough to understand what survival costs. He just showed up. Every morning, 2 coffees, the bench, the dark. On the 4th morning, Noah said, "You don't have to do this." "I know. So why?" "Because someone should have done it a long time ago, for both of us." Noah looked at his coffee. Steam rose from the lid and dissolved into the cold air. Inside the youth center, a light came on. Claire, arriving early, starting the coffee maker, hanging the tutoring sign, doing the small, persistent work of building a place where broken things could come to be repaired. "I talked to Miss Bennett," Noah said. "She offered to let me use the center's address for college applications, instead of my house." "That's smart." "She also said—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "She said if I needed a place to stay, while my mom is figuring things out, I could stay with her and Marcus." Gage looked at him. The boy's face was controlled, composed. The same mask he'd worn every morning in the coffee shop, every morning in the rail yard, every morning of a life that had required him to hide need behind competence and loneliness, behind independence. But beneath the mask, in the corners of his eyes and the set of his jaw, something was emerging. Not hope. Hope was too clean a word for it. Something rougher. Something that had been buried so deep for so long that it didn't have a name yet, only a sensation, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb for years. "What did you say?" Gage asked. "I said I'd think about it." "And?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 days." "That's a lot of thinking." "I've never had a room with a door that closes." The sentence sat between them. Not heavy, not dramatic, just true. A fact stated with the matter-of-fact precision of a boy who had measured his life in absences, absent doors, absent parents, absent safety, and was now being offered the presence of something he'd trained himself not to want, because wanting things you couldn't have was its own kind of wound. "Say yes," Gage said. Noah looked at him. "Yeah? Yeah. Is that advice or an order?" "It's a suggestion from a man who spent 20 years refusing help because he thought needing people was weakness. It isn't. It's the hardest damn thing you'll ever do, but it's worth it." Noah almost smiled. Not quite. The same ghost smile from the park on Caldwell Avenue, visible for a quarter second, gone before it could be fully cataloged. But this time it lasted a fraction longer, a half second instead of a quarter. Progress measured in increments so small that only someone watching very closely would notice. Gage was watching very closely. 6 weeks after the freight depot, on a Saturday morning cold enough to frost windshields, A different truck parked outside the Ridgemont Youth Center. Not blue, not tinted. A white box truck with the Iron Saints Motorcycle Repair Shop logo on the side. A wrench crossed with a crankshaft, no club insignia, nothing that would alarm a parent dropping off a child for tutoring. Decker drove. Harlan rode shotgun. Two prospects sat in the back with the cargo, 12 boxes of school supplies, 4 refurbished laptops, a set of folding tables to replace the ones in the center that wobbled on uneven legs, and 3 cases of coffee for Bowman's, purchased at wholesale and delivered with a handwritten note from Linda's favorite customer that read, "For the kids who come in before school. Keep the pot on." Claire met them at the door. She directed the unloading with the same careful efficiency she applied to everything, pointing, organizing, making space. Marcus helped carry boxes. He was small for 14, but he moved with a quiet determination that reminded Gage of someone, though it took him a moment to realize who. Noah. Noah was inside, setting up the new tables. He'd moved into Claire's house 8 days ago. The room had a door, it closed, it locked. He tested the lock 4 times the first night, not because he was afraid of anything getting in, but because the mechanical reality of a lock, the click, the resistance, the certainty, was a sensation he needed to experience repeatedly before he could believe it was real. Gage carried the last box inside, set it on a table, looked around the youth center, the new tables, the fresh supplies, the corkboard with its crayon drawings and its hand-lettered signs, the coffee maker gurgling in the corner, the fluorescent lights buzzing their invisible frequency. A building, a room, a place where a woman who'd lost her husband and a boy who'd lost his childhood and a man who'd lost his certainty had somehow found themselves in the same space, doing the same work, rebuilding something that none of them could have built alone. He turned to leave. "Gage," Claire said. He stopped at the door. Didn't turn. The October light came through the glass and fell across the linoleum floor in a rectangle that reached almost to his boots. "The sign," she said, "on the door, the tutoring one." "What about it?" "I'm making a new one, expanding the hours. Mornings, before school, 6 to 7:30. He did turn then. She was standing by the whiteboard, dry erase marker in her hand, her face carrying something that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. Not happiness, that was too simple. Something more structural, a foundation where there had been a void. The look of a woman who had finally understood why her husband died and had decided that the answer, however terrible, was also a beginning. 6 a.m., Gage said. "That's early. I know someone who's always up by then." She looked at Noah. Noah looked at Gage. "I'll bring the coffee," Gage said. He walked out. The morning was bright and sharp, and the air tasted like frost and wood smoke and the faintest trace of exhaust from the Harleys idling in the parking lot where Decker and Harlan waited. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, high and pale, the color of ice, the color of something cleaned. Gage mounted the Heritage Custom. The engine turned over with its familiar low growl, the sound that had been his therapy, his anchor, his substitute for the peace he'd never found in offices or clinics, or the bottom of a bottle. He sat for a moment, hands on the grips, feeling the vibration travel through his palms and up his forearms and into his chest cavity, where it settled against a space that felt different than it had 6 weeks ago. Not empty, not full. Rearranged. Reconfigured. The geological layers shifted into a new formation that could carry weight he hadn't been able to carry before. Not because the weight had changed, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. He pulled out of the parking lot. Decker fell in behind him. Harlan behind Decker. 3 motorcycles on a quiet street in a small town on a cold Saturday morning, engines rumbling at a frequency that made the windows of Bowman's coffee house vibrate softly in their frames. Linda looked up from behind the counter, watched them pass, shook her head once, the slow, knowing head shake of a woman who had served coffee to every kind of person this town produced, and had learned long ago that the most important things happen before sunrise, between strangers, in sentences so ordinary that most people don't even notice them. Sentences like the one a 16-year-old boy had said on a Tuesday morning in late October, standing at a window with a cup of free coffee, looking at a truck that nobody else had bothered to see. "That blue pickup has been parked here every morning." 7 words. Spoken to a room. heard by one man, and everything that followed, every rescue, every revelation, every act of broken men putting themselves between danger and the people who couldn't fight it alone, began there. Not with a badge, not with a courtroom, not with a gun, with a boy who noticed and a biker who listened.